What's your small town secret stories, viewer edition?
You want to know the secret to most small towns? It's that they're boring. I grew up and lived in a couple different small towns, and there's usually not much going on, but sometimes they've got some pretty interesting secrets, and I guess you decided to share a few with us. Story 1. There were a set of brothers in my town that were in love with the same girl. They were all like 14, 15. Well, while the girl was saying the one brother, she was feeding the flames of the other brother. I love you but can never be with you as long as your brothers are around, type of thing. Eventually, she convinced the brother that to be together, he'd have to murder his brother, and this kid completely dismembered him and buried him in the front yard. Obviously, they got caught for it, but it completely drove their parents insane. I don't know what happened to the mother, but the father completely snapped. Stuck in the house that his son murdered his other son and then was dragged off to prison. He'd sit outside on Halloween and show you where his son murdered and buried the other, as if telling a ghost story. It was almost as if it were a ghost story that had happened to a previous owner, but he owned it all the same. Crap was nuts. That got extreme real fast. That escalated quickly. Like, she's just like, yeah, I can only be with you if you murder your brother. And then he did. That's horrifying. Folks, nobody's worth murdering over. Don't do that. Story 2. This was one that a lot of people knew about but rarely admitted to knowing, except those in that class. We had a 6th grade science teacher who got tired of hearing snotty 11-year-olds curse in her classroom, a big deal in the 70s. Well, she said we had no idea what we were even saying. So one day our science lesson consisted of her writing every curse word she could think of on the chalkboard and explaining exactly what each meant. She used the correct Latin terms, and then straight up English was quite precise and stern in a way that none of us dared giggle at. But of course, someone talked, and she was fired. She was unapologetic, but the school was terribly embarrassed. That this was a tall, dignified, and elegant woman, wife, and mother in her 50s shocked a lot of people. Hey, in a small town, it was a big thing. You know, I'm all for the belief in the power of words, but not when it comes to cursing. I mean, I don't care if kids say, I guess, the words that I can't say because then YouTube would get mad. I guess I do believe in the power of curse words.
Story 3. A few years back, I had a coworker who was an old military vet and spent his weekends reliving the glory days skydiving. He got diagnosed with cancer and was found dead soon after due to a skydiving accident. The thing is, he was a very experienced skydiver, and his parachute was found rather far from his body. It was ruled an accidental death, but those of us that know him are pretty sure he decided how he wanted to go out and spare his family the pain of watching him wither away slowly. Story 4. My town of Waco, Texas is mostly well known for the Waco Siege, even though it wasn't technically in Waco. It was the biggest town that was nearest to the location by 13 miles. But there are a good amount of hidden secrets and stories about the town. My personal favorite is around a lookout point in the local city park called Lover's Leap. It's one of the most fantastic high points that look out to the lower Brazos Valley, and you can see the river below as well. The story behind the name? Well, there were 2 rival tribes that lived in the area, and the daughter of the chief of one tribe met and fell in love with a warrior of the rival tribe. Both tribes weren't too happy about it and threatened to go to war. Well, to prevent it from happening, the 2 lovers climbed to the top of the cliff, jumped, and fell to their deaths. It's basically a classic Romeo and Juliet kind of legend that is also listed as ghost story as well. They say that if you walk down the riverside trail below the cliff, you could see 2 wispy, ghostly orbs of the 2 lovers dancing among the trees, dancing in eternal matrimony. Story 5. When I was little, I remember my mom telling me about how one day a bunch of people in our town had dreams, maybe even the same dream, about being abducted by a UFO and interrogated by aliens, including her. It caused a huge buzz when it happened, but eventually some government official was asked about it, and he made a comment about how ridiculous it was and called it mass hysteria. which seemed to make the people who experienced it too embarrassed to talk about it anymore, and eventually people just forgot. It's not the only time UFOs have been a thing here, though. Apparently, my grandpa and a bunch of neighbors saw some kind of weird craft doing maneuvers either near or in the town airport, moving up and down vertically and spinning. Though now people who know about it think that it was probably an experimental military craft. Maybe even an early version of a drone, since the way it was moving was similar to drones. And the maneuvers it was doing are a lot like the ones done when testing how a drone moves. It makes me wonder if the UFO dreams might also have been the result of some shady military test, since the time when it happened lines up with the tail end of other effed up government tests on unsuspecting civilians.
I mean, I'm not sure which of the reasons I prefer. Aliens? I mean, that's interesting. It's kind of cool, but a little more unknown. Doesn't feel as believable. Government experiments? Well, it feels a little more reasonable, but also kind of uncomfortable because I don't like them doing that stuff. So, let's go with, aliens.
Story 6. I have 2 small-town secrets about where I live. 1, there's a horrible teacher that worked at my high school who even the other teachers hated. It was rumored that her husband is actually rich and owns half the county, which is the only reason the woman is even employed when she's known to have multiple fireable offenses. 2, there's almost no actual crime here, but police funding is based entirely on how many arrests they make. This results in the police where I live falsifying arrest reports and randomly arresting innocent people for no real reason. They've also been known to abuse their power, like when a cop turned on his sirens just to get his lunch from the drive-thru at McDonald's. Bonus secret. According to a bank manager, the richest person in town looks like he's homeless. Being a bank manager, he knows how much money is in everyone's bank account, and apparently this dirty, homeless-looking dude is freaking loaded. He's not allowed to disclose personal information, so no one knows exactly who he was talking about. There are several actual homeless people who live around here. But apparently one guy is secretly the richest person in town and is just super stingy with his money.
You know, I know there are a lot of mixed feelings about the police. I know I've said some things that aren't always, 100% yay cops because, yeah. But I think one thing that we should all agree upon is funding based on arrests. Because when that's basically like, you'll make money based on the service you provide, but we don't want them to have to arrest people. It's such a dumb system. And how can you defend that? If you'd like to defend it, I wouldn't recommend it in the comments. People are going to eat you alive. It's not good.
Story 7. I grew up in the backwater boonies of Pennsylvania, and growing up there has always been a story passed down at least a few generations now about how there is rumored to be a dead body of a railroad worker sealed inside the cement of a very old stone bridge on the outskirts of town. I don't think it's ever been confirmed, but I've passed under it many times growing up and keep wondering about it as it's always just been unspoken lore. Story 8. I am a base brat. Grew up on military bases across the country. One town where we lived, there was a playground known as Bone Park. It was a children's playground that was built over a former cemetery and mass grave from a cholera outbreak. Kids had been finding remains for years. Second dark secret is the town where I did most of high school. The base commander was later revealed to be a serial killer. He was convicted, but bizarrely still collects a military pension due to an oversight that there were no provisions to revoke it. Story 9. My hometown has some of the worst police on the force. There are several unsolved murders. Thing is, everyone who was living in the area strongly suspected the police chief's adult son. The first murder, the PC called a press conference to tell the public that his son wasn't a suspect and to stop tying up the tip lines with false allegations. The second one was a gas station massacre with multiple bodies. My grandma worked with a man who had stopped to get gas and saw who went in before the shooting started. Their supervisor told him to go to the cops and give a statement. He decided he would after his shift. The next workday, he and his whole family were gone. They'd left town in the middle of the night. No notice, no forwarding address. Any relatives in town were tight-lipped as to where they'd gone.
Now listen here. It can't be my son who did the murders because I'm the police chief. And that means that I obey the law the most. And that means that my son at least obeys the law 50%. And, assuming that my wife is a criminal. And a 50% criminal, that doesn't do crimes. And so, my son is innocent. And if you say otherwise, I'll murder you. Cut the feed.
Story 10. My town and a couple nearby had 5 girls go missing in the 70s and are considered to be linked to each other, but they were never solved. There's a podcast about it that came out about a year or two ago that kind of brought it back into the conversation. A couple of years ago, they actually found one of their bodies, I believe. Same town but unrelated, but not too long ago, one of my teachers got arrested for taking voyeuristic photos of girls. Unfortunately, both my sisters had him. He was also genuinely well-liked and seemed to be a nice guy. Story 11. Mostly a neighborhood housing estate secret thing rather than small town, and I only found out about it as an adult. The street I grew up on had a caught, convicted, and done his time in prison nonce. Why the local council decided to put him in an area that had 4 primary schools and a high school within a 5-minute walk from that street baffles me. But every adult in the area knew who he was and what he had done. I often woke up in the middle of the night to police and ambulances on the street outside the same address each time. That was because the local crime boss would gather many dads of the estate together for a little hunting party where they would go to the nonce's place and beat 7 bells of crap out of him as a reminder to not touch any of the kids in the area. Everyone knew who had done it, but always said they didn't know or didn't see anything, so nobody got caught. Eventually, the beatings grew more frequent, and he was moved to a different place as he feared for his life. The hunting party caught wind of this, had someone follow his moving van and find his new address, then they went around as many people as the cloud with his photo and his crimes so that the beatings would continue in the new place. He was moved again, and that's where the trail went cold, and I have no idea what happened to the guy. There are other things, like the local high school had a massive old oak tree, a beautiful thing just outside its grounds before I was born, but it was cut down and erased from existence after a high schooler hung himself on it. While I attended that high school, one of the female teachers was caught pleasing herself under the desk mid-lesson. Story 12. Also from my hometown, Portland, Oregon, I used to work as a security guard. I had some schools that I patrolled at night that were on the southeast side of the county that were built mostly in the 50s and 60s. One, however, Pleasant Valley Elementary, was built originally, from what I could tell from old pictures, sometime in the late 1800s. It then burnt to the ground sometime in the early 1900s and was rebuilt in 1940 on the same foundation and the same style as the old school. Fellow guards basically refused to patrol the grounds at night as it was in the middle of the woods. There were stories of screaming from the woods, tapping on the basement windows at night, and even a few ghost kid sightings in the windows. The second school was Alisod Elementary, built in the early 50s. It still looks like it never got any renovations, exposed radiators and yellowing paneled windows on the wood doors. The janitorial staff said that at night you could sometimes hear the first principal's wife walking down the linoleum-tiled hallways in her stiletto heels, hear the click, clack as she walked. But if you looked into the hallway, it was always empty.
I have to say, I don't think it matters how old an elementary school is. An abandoned elementary school is an inherently creepy place. And I say this because the bakery that I worked for, the main, the ovens, the bookkeeping, and all the delivery stuff that I handled, that was all done out of my old elementary school. The elementary school I went to as a little kid, it got shut down in my early 20s. The bakery bought it for a space to use. Didn't use more than we used the gym, the cafeteria, and a couple offices. And then there's just a whole bunch of abandoned elementary school. And I worked there doing deliveries in the middle of the night. And if I occasionally walked down to those halls, even though I went there as a kid, it wasn't that old of a building. It was creepy.
Story 13. This isn't a secret, but it is an interesting / slightly relevant story. I was probably in 6th or 7th grade. We live in a middle-class suburban neighborhood. I was sitting on the front porch looking at Pinterest when I heard a few of my younger sisters talking to someone with a male voice. The cars in the driveway blocked my view. I was instantly suspicious, so I got up and went to go check it out. I'm the oldest of 5 girls, and the ones that were outside that day were all several years younger than me. I can't remember if my second oldest sister was there. If she was, it would have been a 9 to 10 years old, 6 to 7-year-old, and possibly a 3 to 4-year-old girl out that day. Sorry, my memory isn't great, but this was almost 5 years ago, and I don't remember much from middle school. Anyways, I walk past the cars and see this dude on a bicycle talking to my sister by the mailbox. I was instantly creeped out, so I came up to make sure everything was all right. He asked me if I had seen his dog. He explained it was a chubby little dog. When I asked him what his name was, he said it was Lexi. I was trying to act like I wasn't suspicious of him, so he didn't try to do anything. He said to let him know if we saw it, so I said okay. The next thing that happened was really weird. My old neighbor, who's a big guy and into boats, hunting, fishing, etc., came out to see what was going on. As soon as the guy who was talking to my sister saw the neighbor, he instantly took off on his bike up the hill. I brought all my sisters inside and told my mom what had happened. A day or two later, Mom showed me a picture of a guy on the S-offender registry and asked if that was the guy who had talked to us. I said yes, I thought so. A few days after that, the guy had actually ridden back down our hill and around the cul-de-sac. Later that morning, my dad was giving a statement to a police officer. He had me come out and tell the story too. I told the story as best as I remembered it, and then stood on the porch while my dad talked with the cop. Luckily, we haven't seen the creep since, and we now have several Ring cameras around our house. Whenever I remember that incident, I'm so glad that my parents taught my sisters and me stranger danger. I also thank God that I was outside that day because my sisters were all young and probably didn't think much about the guy talking to them. It makes my blood run cold when I think of what might have happened if my neighbors hadn't come outside and scared the guy away, or if I hadn't been on the porch keeping an ear out. I know the creep couldn't have easily kidnapped children while riding a bike, but he might have gotten them to follow him, and then goodness knows what would happen. Be careful, everyone. There are creeps everywhere, even in relatively nice neighborhoods. Please teach your kids to not blindly trust strangers, because you never know when they will need that skill.
While I do think that there might be a little too overprotective of parenting with kids to some degree this day and age, this is just straight up good advice. Adults who are stopping and having a chat with kids, like, if you're not a creeper, you shouldn't do that. You should look for an adult because it looks real bad and those kids should be scared and people gonna get you. So just be kind of smart. And kids out there, adults, good adults, should not want to just talk with you, probably, unless you know them, and even if you do, maybe be cautious.
Story 14. A pair of hunters came out here and went out to camp at a nearby cove. We heard a gunshot at some point, and one of the men comes after a few hours asking if we've seen his buddy. It wasn't until later that we hear that the man shot the other and tried to pass it off that the guy got lost in the countryside and tried to threaten my uncle who flew them out here to leave the troopers out of this. They were waiting at the airport when my uncle went back to bring the guy back, having phoned ahead of time. Story 15. Where I live, it's in the country, and if you have family history here, then that means you're from at least one of the well-known families around here. We're all familiar with each other's history, including who's related to who. One family in particular, at some point a couple hundred years ago, had a lot of mixed-raced people due to slavery. At some point, they decided they liked their lighter-skinned, mixed-raced appearances and began to only have children with one another to keep the appearances in the family. Their children were encouraged to marry their own cousins or other relatives rather than marry someone from a darker-skinned family, since at the time it was illegal for one of them to marry anyone white. So in their mind, incest was the only good option. My grandma told me that they, of course, had to eventually stop because the children were being born with devastating deformities and disabilities. Most of the families are aware of their history, but if you meet someone from that family, you certainly don't bring it up and you don't discuss it with outsiders either. Used to be friends with a girl from that family back in elementary school until she moved away. She was fun to hang out with. Story 16. I live in a small town in Texas. Back in the late 80s, an 18-year-old boy was found strung from a tree. It appeared he'd hung himself. Rumors quickly spread across town that he was part of a satanic cult that had been around for a couple years at that point, and it was believed that he'd either sacrificed himself for the cult or he'd been murdered due to his affiliation. 3 years later, his older sister was also found dead. It's unknown if her death was cult-related or not. Both were exhumed, and autopsies show they both had high levels of Elevil in their systems, which pointed to both deaths being homicides. This was before I was born, and it's kind of taboo to talk about because nobody knows if any of it is true. How big the cult is, or was, nobody knows. Story 17. I don't live in my hometown anymore as I recently moved 12 hours away, but there's an urban legend about a white entity in the woods that murdered an entire family. It was given the name the White Screamer because of the blood-curdling screams that came from the woods sometimes. The stories have been told since the 1800s, but now that I'm really thinking about it, the urban legend probably came from someone who heard a mountain lion screaming. It still gives me the creeps even though I live so far away now. There have been multiple sightings of it from people throughout the years, and this story always reminds me of the game Until Dawn.
Now, I don't want to downplay a family getting potentially killed by a, mountain lion or something like that. That's terrible, but it happened in the 1800s. And it did create this cool legend of the White Screamer, and I don't know. I think that's just fascinating that something that, you could look back on and be like, there's a rational explanation for it, but I don't know, some kind of creepy little local horror story came up from it, and I don't know what that says about people. I guess maybe it's positive. I hope so.
Story 18. My mom's hometown had a serial killer. I don't know the details. Mom only mentioned it once in a story about why she never uses Ouija boards. She tried looking it up, but this would have been well before the internet, so I couldn't find anything. And they might have hushed it up. I know my mom once pointed out a house as we were driving by on a visit and said, "That's the place where the lady committed self-termination." Self-termination, we asked? Yeah, she said. Apparently she stabbed herself, threw herself down a flight of stairs, and then hung herself, and somehow it was ruled as self-termination. Or at least that's as close as I can remember to the conversation. And if they hushed up that one, who knows how many other deaths were ruled as self-terminations or accidents when they were really homicides. I know the serial killings happened when she was a teenager, so around 40 years ago, but that's the most I know about it. Because, of course, the creepy story about people using a Ouija board during a series of serial killings and being scarred for life over whatever happened would involve teenagers. And no, my mom isn't flighty, superstitious, prone to lying, or anything similar. That is the only story like that she's ever told me. Everything she's ever said has been serious. She never even tells jokes. She is very much grounded. Her only flight of fancy, so far as I know, is her persistent belief that God made dinosaur bones as a joke because religion is a hell of a drug. So, I believe her, because of all my family, she's not one of the ones who would make up a story like that.
I mean, aside from the whole God making dinosaur bones as a joke thing, yeah, your mom sounds like a reliable source. And, I mean, I would believe it. I think it would be weird if a parent made up a story about a serial killer and stuff. So, yeah, sounds like your mom has a frankly unnerving story to share with you. What lucky children.
Story 19. I grew up in a mid to small size city, so not really applicable, but the neighborhood I grew up in had a few notable events. One neighbor's house blew up. Poor guy was a smoker, so his sense of smell was poor. He had a gas leak, woke up, went to light up, and boom. Another neighbor on the next block, I knew his wife and had been tutoring her in Japanese before this happened. He snapped and held her hostage. The SWAT team's bomb robot, which they used for this for whatever reason, apparently knocked the house off its foundation. Plus, every surface was covered with tear gas, so I think the house was condemned and her husband shot himself after letting her go. Really messed up part is his mother owned the house and lives right across the street, and she'd had 2 sons and the other one had also killed himself in that house, but apparently before my family moved in. So she lived where she'd have to look at the house where both her sons killed themselves every day. Well, I speak of her in the present tense, but I haven't spent time in that neighborhood since my parents moved out a couple of years ago, so maybe she's passed as well by now. Story 20. My town had a pair of brothers who invited a girl over to fix her bike. They killed her and put her in a trash bag. One of them was caught, but the other ran away but was caught. Whenever we find her signature in a book at school, we think of how psychotic those brothers were. We also named a park after her, and our local Twin Kiss has named an ice cream after her, I believe. Rest in peace, Autumn Pascal. Story 21. My story isn't a small-town secret, but rather a neighborhood secret. There's a rumor that decades ago, the owner of the property that is now my neighborhood murdered his maid and buried the body in the area that's now my street. My family had a house built on the street, and my mom was paranoid they'd dig up the remains during construction. Nothing was uncovered, but it's still interesting to think that there might be a skeleton buried somewhere on my street.
Man, this is either the worst or best game of Clue anyone's ever played.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.